NSW site visit presentation brought to you by myself, introducing the people who gave us Hainanese pork chops, the Singapore sling, Hainanese curry rice, kaya, curry puffs, chicken rice, and let's not forget the spaces we Singaporeans so fondly refer to as kopitiams, where we join together to bond over the coffee we so love. Let us thank the Hainanese. And what better way to thank them than to do an exploration of the Hainanese culture and identity in Singapore? This brings me to the topic of this site visit, which looks at Hainanese culture in Singapore. What Hainanese culture in Singapore is, with a particular focus on the notion that it is gradually fading. I'll explore the implications of this in terms of how Hainanese people feel about these changes and what it means to the Hainanese community in Singapore, as well as try to understand why it may be fading, based on the Singapore context. My cultural and ethnic roots form my reasons for choosing this topic, whereby both my mother's paternal and maternal ancestors came from Hainan 3 or more generations ago. This is an aspect of my identity that I'm unfortunately disconnected from, hence my desire to find out more about it in a Mandarinized Singapore. So what is this Mandarinization? Well, it's a term that refers to the process of making someone or something Mandarin, and though Wiktionary, as seen here, may not be the most reliable source, we see that the terms Mandarinized and Mandarinization are commonly used in reference to making language more Mandarin, as seen in the various papers below, as well as in the article on You Don't Ask Me to Speak Mandarin. For my site visit, I went to Thomson Nature Park, one of the less well-known nature reserves in Singapore. What is even less known is the gems hidden inside the park, namely the ruins of a Hainanese village which was home to predominantly Hainanese migrants between the 30s and 80s before being abandoned for modern housing. The nature park was only open to the public toward the end of 2019, almost 40 years after the village was left to be overgrown by vegetation, forming the astonishing yet somewhat lamentable scenery of today. As the article here points out, the park features accounts, art, and archive materials gathered from former Hainan village residents. I can attest to this, whereby the numerous informative boards provided detailed general and personal accounts of life in the Hainanese village, covering the migration from Hainan to Singapore, agriculture and infrastructure, and more. As you can see, however, the panels are in a rather sorry state, and some are barely legible due to the overgrown fungi and dirt, perhaps a testament to a certain attitude toward the park and the stories of the Hainanese people that are told. Let us go into some further context of Hainanese in Singapore. Firstly, we'll look at what Hainanese culture is and how it is experienced. So for a quick introduction to my two interviewees with whom I spoke about the Hainanese experience. The first, Tanyok Han, a Gen Z second-year student at Yale and US College, son to a Hainanese father and Hokkien mother. The second interviewee, Stella, with the Hainanese name Ho Hui Fern, was easy to find, given she's my mother, a Gen X businesswoman with a Hainanese mother and father. So the two people I've selected here are from two different generations, whereby Stella was a teenager when the Speak Mandarin campaigns were implemented and even used to visit the legendary kampongs that existed in Singapore. And Yok is a young adult who can attest to the current Hainanese experience and what it's like today. So to get a sense of dialect representation in Singapore, we see that the Hainanese community only has a 6.1% representation as of 2020. Now I did a quick Google search on the top 5 dialects here. So for Hokkien, we see references to language, food, family tree. Teochew, we have opera, people, and food. Hakka, people, food, identity, and last but not least, we have chicken rice, and more chicken rice, and more, and it goes on. But is Hainanese culture really limited to culinary achievements? Let's ask my interviewees and Han Ming Guang.
Instinctively think of Hainanese chicken rice or Hainanese chicken curry, which I think is very reductive of an entire culture of an entire island.
However, Stella doesn't mind at all.
Hainanese are foodies. Like, food is our life. Has such a strong influence in Singapore and how we have, kind of emboldened into this food-centered culture.
Alright, so the Hainanese identity is certainly tied to food, but what are some other aspects to explore? The Hainanese arrived in Singapore considerably later than other ethnicities and Chinese dialects who had established roots around 1820s. It's been posited that significant numbers of Hainanese migrants only started coming to Singapore in the 1840s onwards. As can be seen if you look very carefully in the panels here from the Hainan village, it reads, many had to work as seamen, others were limited to taking on jobs in the service industry, such as cooks and domestic servants for wealthy families. This is referred to by G. William Skinner as ethnic division of labor, and the stratifying effects of these predicaments were very clear in how, given their predisposition to unwanted jobs and low socioeconomic class, other dialects and the European community looked down on Hainanese people. This meant that the Hainanese community had to solely rely on each other, leading the Singapore Hainan Hui Kwan and other Hainanese associations to become very important in supporting Hainanese people in Singapore and really enforcing the sense of community, solidarity, and separateness from other Chinese dialect groups.
It's about having a sense of identity, because if you come to Singapore and a lot of them come as coolies and workers, they need to send money back to China, to Hainan. So the Crown would help them to do this kind of thing, also arranging accommodation when a new set of migrants are moving to Singapore.
I think my dad used to be quite involved with Hainanese Hui Kwan. I think maybe like 10-20 years ago. I think over time his involvements have kind of decreased, but he also said that the Hui Kwan's involvements have also kind of like with it down over the years.
The diminishing of the SHHK is a clear example of how Hainanese culture and community is gradually losing its value, whereby Singaporeans have become more individualistic rather than collectivistic and communal over decades of PAP rule, which strongly emphasizes economic growth and, by virtue of promoting a homogenous Chinese Singaporean identity, essentially doesn't leave room for our dialects. Speaking of the PAP, let us explore some policies they have implemented in SG and how these may have affected the Hainanese community, namely the Speak Mandarin campaign and HDB housing policies.
Because of this miscommunication between the different dialects group, especially, not many people understand Hainanese or Hakka. So the government decided to have this Speak Mandarin campaign. My family started to speak Mandarin every day with me. And over the years, I noticed that I lost the ability to speak fluently in Hainanese, though I understand every word. And my Mandarin has improved by leaps and bounds due to this campaign. So I think in a way it is good and bad, because in a way I lost the Hainanese culture.
I personally couldn't speak the Hainanese language very well. I definitely could have, on my part, when I was younger, taken more of an initiative to learn Hainanese better from my family, considering that so many people speak Hainanese. But I guess I struggled enough with Mandarin Chinese.
What about the sense of community in HDBs today as opposed to villages and ethnic enclaves present before?
We grew up in city area, first in Purvis, and then we had a short stint in Toa Payoh before moving to around Rochor area, Bugis.
So much urban planning efforts have gone into developing spaces that are meant for people to congregate together and spend time together. Like, you have playgrounds and void decks, but everyone's just too busy in their own flats doing work or studying. They don't have time to go out and share a meal, have potluck with their neighbors. Yeah. And I think it's definitely something that Singapore's lost about, this rustic feeling of community.
Yeah. So what are your feelings about this?
Yeah, I think my dad has mentioned how it's a bit disheartening to see future generations not connect with their dialect.
It's a pity to lose it, really. Not just about the communication part, but also it's a great identity.
Now let's try to build an understanding of all that we learned. We see the lived experiences, but how does it all link back to the diminishing of the Hainanese culture, particularly looking at how government policies have implemented radical change in Singapore and effectively limited the Hainanese and other communities to what they are today. You are listening to the Speak Mandarin campaign song. With the SEM launched in 1979, the PAP sets an anti-dialect and pro-Mandarin stance, ethnicizing non-Mandarin Sinitic varieties in Singapore. Words used to describe dialects included vulgar, uneducated, divisive, and primitive. Meanwhile, Mandarin was considered refined and unifying. The speed at which Mandarin became a norm in Chinese households is explicit evidence of the success of the campaign, as was seen in Stella's household, for instance. In Mandarinization and the construction of Chinese ethnicity in Singapore, the authors highlight how the SEM prevented SHHK and other Hainanese associations from officially including the Hainanese dialect as part of their attempts to promote dialect identity. This faced resistance from dialect speakers who believed that language carried values of the language's culture with them. Hence, eradicating dialect would equate to eliminating their roots and sense of identity. Lim, Chen, and Hiramoto also mentioned that in the last decade, associations have seen growing interest from young heritage language learners, whereby the parts of the general public have demonstrated a rekindling with their Chinese Singaporean identity, although I will mention that my quick Google search on Hainanese language classes was not fruitful beyond cooking lessons. As Stella pointed out earlier, the Speak Mandarin campaign, as well as a shift towards English in schools, greatly improved the ability of people of different races and ethnicities to communicate with each other, allowing for a more interracial space, despite the attempted and perhaps partially successful eradication of dialect identity. Now let's dive into the physical location aspect of culture. As Stella mentioned, she was born on Purvis Street, a location which, along with Sia and Middle Street, was mostly inhabited by Hainanese immigrants. Stella's grandfather even owned a couple of buildings in this once Hainanese enclave. But we see that later, she moved to Toa Payoh, originally a swampland full of kampongs, which in the 1960s became the first town designed and developed entirely by the Housing and Development Board. So even Stella experienced the shift from a distinctly Hainanese Singaporean physical space to a racially integrated, albeit more individualistic one, an aspect which HDB housing has become somewhat notorious for, and which Yoko also mentions, namely the lack of community that HDBs allow for, especially in contrast with the kampongs we hear about, and the tight-knit community that we see existed in Hainan village, for instance. So how and why did all this happen? Moore highlights how, given spatial segregation, there was a lack of social cohesion on a nationwide basis, whereby dialect groups formed ethnic enclaves and did not integrate with each other. From the 1960s, which is when Hainan village was at its peak, by the way, public housing was used as an instrument to reduce the formation of enclaves and integrate the different ethnic groups, whereby HDB policy includes race quotas for each building. Today, 80% of the resident population in Singapore live in HDBs. We see here that the Hainanese community went from being a physically and socially close one, given language, ethnic enclaves, common experiences, and even a strong clan association, and is now a scattered people, some of whom, especially in the younger generations, feel no connection to the Hainanese aspect of their heritage. These elements of culture can still be seen and taught in Hainan village, embodying the Hainanese of the past. Today, Hainanese culture is different, and though it may be diminishing, my hope is that whether or not we continue to learn the language or engage with other Hainanese people, we continue to explore our own identities and heritage, always remembering and appreciating our roots.